And good evening, everybody, and welcome to the interview room on this amazing Sunday night.
Thanks for being here with us, everybody.
Where are you from? Show us in the chat. Where are you in the world? Welcome to the coolest true crime podcast on YouTube. And I've got the brains of the operation. I love this girl. We're so grateful to have the opportunity to serve you. And boy, we have an amazing guest for you this evening.
We are very, very excited.
I'm super excited.
Guest coming on.
So show us where you are. We got Mexico in the house, Quebec, Orange County, Kentucky, Richmond, Virginia. Let's see, Idaho, Missouri, Canada, Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, England, top of the morning to you, and Ireland as well, coming at you. Australia, Florida, Wisconsin. Man, are we blessed?
We are.
We're so lucky. Thank you so much. And we only ask one thing as you come into our channel, and that is if you hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up. That's it. And you give us your time. And thank you for trusting us with your time. Hun, who do we have coming in this evening?
Well, let's bring her on and introduce her.
All right. So let me introduce.
All right. Welcome, CeCe. We have CeCe Moore with us tonight, the DNA expert you have seen everywhere. And we are so excited that she is here with us. Welcome, CeCe.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this and interacting with your audience.
Yeah, we are too. So guys, if you are not familiar with CeCe and her background, she's an internationally recognized DNA and true crime expert and an Emmy-nominated creator whose frequent media appearances have led her to being called the face of genetic genealogy. Boy, that is very, very true.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah. Through collaboration with hundreds of investigative agencies, CeCe has led the Parabon genetic genealogy team to the unparalleled record of well over 365 successful identifications of violent criminal suspects and unidentified decedents. She's been doing this since 2018 in that capacity.
Wow.
For over a decade ago, CeCe began developing and teaching the now widely used unknown parentage genetic genealogy techniques that have become the foundation of the IGG field. And in 2013, CeCe founded the DNA Detectives, which has grown to be the largest genetic genealogy educational online community with, I believe, 240,000 plus members and growing.
Wow.
And she co-founded the Institute for Genetic Genealogy.
I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy.
So she is obviously an incredible resource, and we're grateful she's here. And we're going to talk DNA regarding the Nancy Guthrie case. And then at the end, we're going to take your questions for CeCe. So we're grateful that she's here. Yeah, Chris,
you get to interact with the legend herself. So this is really super, super exciting. So with that foundation set, CeCe, What do you, welcome to our program tonight. And you know what I did as an amateur, I put together a couple of simple slides. And so just keep me on the straight and narrow. So I'll put this one up here. You know, go ahead.
I'm not sure if, for YouTube if we want to be showing the blood sample up there.
Okay.
Really briefly, we always want to adhere by YouTube guidelines. So we'll maybe gloss over that one a little bit, or we'll bring it on and then we'll back off of it.
Okay. Well, from a law enforcement perspective, CODIS is just the database that every suspect who gets arrested in modern technology today is swabbed. They're put into this database, and then law enforcement can use that database for arrest purposes. But this is much, much different than what you do, right, CeCe?
Exactly right.
Why don't we start there?
Yeah, let's go to, do you have your slide on STRs?
I sure do. Let me put that up.
So law enforcement has been using STRs, or short tandem repeats, for decades to arrest, charge, and convict people of crimes. But this type of DNA is not compatible with what we need for genetic genealogy. And so if an agency only has an STR profile, that traditional law enforcement genetic profile, we can't perform genetic genealogy from that. So if they've consumed all of the DNA evidence and they have nothing left to test, then we're stuck. We can't do it. Because what we need is to create a SNP profile from scratch. So SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So we have to go back to the original biological material and reanalyze it using more advanced technology. And the other difference is we look at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome, typically between about 700 and 850,000 SNPs. Whereas with the CODIS profiles, the law enforcement profile, they really just look at a handful. It used to be 13, now it's 20 genetic markers. So that allows us to broaden the search and to find distant relatives that we can work with.
So that's the IgG.
Exactly. So that is investigative genetic genealogy. The basis of that is this SNP profile. So we have to have biological evidence to be able to analyze to create that SNP profile. So that's something that a lot of law enforcement people really struggled with at the beginning. They kept sending us STR profiles asking if we could perform genetic genealogy on it. But this is a more advanced technology. It's created more recently than the STR analysis. And so this is something that has to be done, as I said, from scratch. And so people, first need to understand that we're using a different type of genetic marker and a different type of analysis.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit, if you wouldn't mind. Break that down for our audience. I mean, because you've been on the ground floor as a pioneer in really the evolution of how DNA has really come into play in solving all of these cases out there. First of all, before you go down that road real fast, what was your favorite case to work on to date?
That's impossible. I mean, because there's different things that stand out about different cases, and favorite is really hard to say, right? Because they're all tragic.
Yeah.
So the one that has stayed with me the most is all of the Robert Brashear's cases. So I had identified a serial killer back in 2018. I worked with 3 different agencies, one in South Carolina, one in Memphis, Tennessee, and one in Missouri State Police, to identify 3 crimes that were all tied to each other through DNA, and a 4th that was tied through ballistics. So that case, even though I identified him and we solved those cases, I could never put it aside. It just stayed with me all the time. And I'm usually really good at compartmentalizing. Once I've done my part on a case, I can set it aside and move on to the next case that needs me. But I would wake up thinking about this guy all the time. And I just knew he had a lot more cases out there, and he was responsible for a lot more tragedy. And my instincts were proven right recently when he was tied to the yogurt shop murders. And that case was finally solved.
The five
4. Yeah.
In
4 young
Alabama? Where was that? I forget.
Austin, Texas.
Austin.
And it was their highest profile case by far. It affected the community so much.
Yeah, I remember that.
4 young girls. 2 of them were sisters, only children of their parents. Totally devastating. And so that is, I wouldn't say, it's my favorite. It's the case I couldn't set aside. But then the case now I'm really proud of that one because they exonerated 4 people 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago based on that identification. And the Angie Dodge case out of Idaho Falls, I helped them find her true killer, and they were able to then formally exonerate Christopher Tapp. So that was really kind of the high point of my career, to not only find the person responsible for her murder and her rape, but to exonerate somebody and finally lift that burden of suspicion off an innocent person.
Isn't that an amazing feeling?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well,
That's really incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Kudos to you, CeCe, for
But
that.
that's also
what you do.
Where you guys are in St. George. That was the first active case that ever used investigative genetic genealogy. So that one was really a milestone too. It was back in 2018, and the brilliant detective Josh Wilson, who's now deceased, wanted so badly to solve a sexual assault and beating of a beloved elderly woman in their community that he turned to genetic genealogy me very quickly after the crime. And we were able to get her attacker off the streets before he hurt anyone else. So that is also a big deal, because that is stopping a criminal in their tracks and keeping them from becoming a serial offender or hurting anyone else. The cold cases, of course, are really important too, but it's a little bit different when you're working active case. It's a race against time. You definitely feel the pressure of trying to, get this person behind bars before anything else happens.
So let's walk the audience through what the process is when an agency, and we'll talk about Nancy. But before we do that, I want to play for the audience, if it's okay with you. I want to play for the audience where the family is at right now and Savannah's last plea to the world, and why your expertise is so important in this investigation going on right now. But I just want to remind everybody what CeCe just mentioned about being up against the clock, being up against time, and how much pressure is put on not only in the investigation, but those individuals working behind the scenes, such as, herself on many, many cases that have been proven solved. This is the kind of scenario that they have to not only take into account, but these are real people. These are real people that she's working with and for. So let me play Savannah real fast, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Hi there. I'm coming on to say it is day 24 since our mom was taken in the dark of night from her bed. And every hour and minute and second and every long night has been agony since then, of worrying about her and fearing for her, and aching for her, and most of all, just missing her, We know that millions of you have been praying. So many people have been praying, of every faith and no faith at all, praying for her return. And we feel those prayers. Please keep praying without ceasing. We still believe. We still believe in a miracle. We still believe that she can come home. Hope against hope. As my sister says, we are blowing on the embers of hope. We also know that she may be lost. She may already be gone. She may have already gone home to the Lord that she loves and is dancing in heaven with her mom and her dad and with her beloved brother Pierce and with our daddy. If this is what is to be, then we will accept it. But we need to know where she is. We need her to come home. For that reason, we are offering a family reward of up to $1 million for any information that leads us to her recovery. All of the information about this reward and the details is in the caption below. You can call the 1-800-TIP line. You can be anonymous if you want. Someone out there knows something that can bring her home. Somebody knows. We are begging you to please come forward now. We also know that we are not alone in our loss. We know there are millions of families that have suffered with this kind of uncertainty. And for that reason today, we also are donating $500,000 to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for their work in helping families who are coping with loss and actively looking for those who are lost. We are hoping that the attention that has been given to our mom and our family will extend to all the families like ours who are in need and need prayers and need support. So please, if you hear this message, if you've been waiting and you haven't been sure, let this be your sign to please come forward, tell what you know, and help us bring our beloved mom home so that we can either celebrate a glorious, miraculous homecoming or celebrate the beautiful, brave, and courageous and noble life that she has lived. Please be the light in the dark. Thank you.
That is hard to listen to.
It is. It's gripping
And
every time.
what are we down to now? We're down to $1 million.
$1 million reward.
What else?
Well, obviously we have photos and video of the suspect on the porch the night her mom, Nancy Guthrie, went missing. We still have vehicles that are still impounded by the Pima County Sheriff's Office. And there is a sense that there is a lot going on behind the scenes with law enforcement that they obviously are holding close to their chest. They're not telling the public. They're not telling the media. But we are left with the DNA. And let's just kind of review for everybody what it is we were told about the DNA in Nancy Guthrie's case that was found inside her home, the crime scene. So we were told that the DNA that they were able to get is from a mixed sample. And the sheriff said that the lab where it was sent was having trouble separating it out. So it's a partial sample, and they said it's not viable to enter into CODIS, which we were just talking about. And the sheriff also said it could take weeks, months, or even up to a year to unravel all that at the Florida lab where the sample is. So I guess my first question, CeCe, is based on what we heard about that, what are ways that they can take that DNA sample that they have? Can they put it through the IgG process? And do you think they can figure out the suspect here, the perpetrator of the crime?
Well, I need to preface my comments with that I'm not working on it, so I don't have inside information, but I can make educated guesses, speculation about what they mean by interpreting the things the sheriff says. So with mixed DNAs, mixed samples of DNA, excuse me, it really depends on the percentages and the proportions of who is in that mixture. Is it 2 people, 3 people, 4 people? Is there a major contributor who's sharing over or who is making up over 40% of that mixture? those are the things that you need to know to determine whether it would be viable for SNP profile analysis, which is what we need. There are different aspects that determine whether it's viable for STRs. So the forensic scientist community has been working with mixed samples for STR analysis for many, many years. So there's a lot of programs like STR Mix that help to separate out those profiles, or try to separate out those profiles to create a STR profile. SNP profiles, as I've said, are totally different. So this is a completely different process. The amazing, brilliant scientists at Parabon, Dr. Ellen Graytek and Dr. Janet Cady, happen to be experts in mixture deconvolution. Deconvolution is when you separate out those profiles. And that is because Parabon started working with forensic samples and with SNP profiles way before anyone else did, because they were creating those snapshot phenotype predictions, right? They needed a lot of genetic information to predict someone's hair color, eye color, skin color, shape, face. And so they really pioneered working with forensic samples, and that meant working with a lot of mixtures. And that hadn't been done with SNP profiling earlier, because we were just spitting in that tube and mailing it into, say, Ancestry or 23andMe, and they were using SNP profiles for health testing. But that was just a single source, high quality DNA from the DNA donor, the contributor, whoever it is that was being tested. So this was the first time that somebody was trying to separate out mixtures for SNP profiles or for forensic samples. And so they created ways to do that. And so we've worked a lot of mixture cases successfully. It's not surprising in sexual assault cases, you often have a mixture. But what I was surprised to learn was many, many cases have mixed blood samples. That's because people fight back, right? And so a lot of times the victims and the perpetrator's DNA ends up mixed, which I'm sure you're familiar with this, Chris. But it was a surprise to me as someone who hadn't had any involvement with law enforcement until 8 years ago, almost 8 years ago. And so if it is a simple mixture like that, if you have the perpetrator and the victim, that's great, because the victim's DNA is known and you can just extract that out and separate it and focus on the perpetrator. So that's what I was hoping. When they first told us there was a mixture, I thought, great, totally doable. And then we heard from the sheriff that it was taking time and it was challenging. Well, I know the lab that's working on it, DNA Labs International, is fantastic. So if it's a challenge and they're struggling with it, that tells me it's a complex mixture. So there's at least two unknown.
Yeah. So what does that mean exactly? I
think, there's at least two unknown contributors in there. It's not a simple mixture, a straightforward mixture, Nancy's DNA and an unknown male. There's going to be multiple DNA contributors that are unknown in that. I don't know if it's two unknown males. I don't know if it's Nancy plus two unknown males. It might be 3, 4 unknown profiles. And we also don't know what the source is. So I was hoping it was blood, because that would obviously be fresh if it was mixed with Nancy's, or saliva, something like that. But if it is transfer DNA, or what's commonly known as touch DNA, that could come from any time. And it also could come from someone who was never even at the location, because we can transfer that to a location that someone's never been at. So I could shake your hand and then go home and transfer your DNA to my home, even if you'd never visited me there. So that's a lot more concerning. And I worry that's what we're dealing with here, especially since he said it could take weeks, months, or years. I think what he was saying, there was a little bit more to that, was that technology would advance. So that tells me that it's not been viable so far, working with the software packages that are out there and the bioinformatics scientists that work with mixtures. At least the ones that DNA Labs International has consulted so far, has not been able to sort it out. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of eyes on this and a lot of people working toward that goal and trying to find new ways to separate out the mixture. But the other problem is, how do we know which one of those people, if any, is the perpetrator, right? Because if there's 3 unknown people or 4 unknown people, how do you know which one you want to identify? So at Parabon, the person we're trying to identify needs to typically be 40% of that mixture or higher. But if your perpetrator is only 10% of that mixture, you've got a big problem. So it's been very concerning. And, there's been a lot of ups and downs in this case. That's a big downer, very concerning to me. But knowing crime scenes as you do, Chris, I'm hoping they collected lots of swabs all over that home, and maybe they still have evidence they can be processing, and they might get lucky and find something that they haven't yet. There's obvious places, which is probably what they're looking at now. But I've worked many cases where a crime scene investigator just had intuition or, trained intuition and swabbed something you wouldn't think to swab, and it ended up being the perpetrator's DNA, and we identified him through that. So I'm holding out hope that there is something still processing. There's probably a lot of stuff the lab has to process, and there's priorities. Maybe some of those lower priority items or swabs might yield something.
I got a question, CeCe. So is the lab doing the STR process, or are they also going to be doing the SNP process, the IgG process, to try to identify the different profiles in there?
So they do both, which is why I think it was actually a good idea of the agency to use them. They got a lot of criticism for that, but this was sort of like a one-stop shop. They are great at extracting DNA. They've extracted the DNA on a lot of my cases because it's not something Parabon does. So we've sent our evidence to them to get it extracted before we create the SNP profile. So they're good at that, extracting difficult DNA samples. And then they are certified, accredited to create the STR profile. And there's also a lot of misconceptions about that. It's really common that private labs are used because our public labs, our government labs, are backed up often.
Yeah, they're stacked.
Yeah. And if you pay a little money to a private lab that's accredited, you can get that STR profile faster a lot of times, and it still can be uploaded to CODIS. I'm sure they have some kind of partnership with a lab or an entity that has approval to upload to CODIS. So that didn't slow anything down. In my opinion, I think it's unlikely it slowed anything down, but it was actually faster because then the evidence was there to create that SNP profile. And they very well may have created those in parallel. Why waste time, right? As you're creating that STR profile, also start creating the SNP profile, just in case you don't get that hit in CODIS. And I think that is what's starting to happen in these active cases more often. Used to be, after all avenues of investigation were exhausted, they would turn to investigative genetic genealogy. But we've proven the power of it now. So I think in some of these cases, what they're doing is they're doing parallel investigations in case that CODIS profile doesn't match to anything in the law enforcement databases. They've lost no time. So I imagine that DNA Labs International was working on both of those. They were extracting DNA, splitting it, creating the STR profile, or attempting to create that SNP profile. Say the glove. Remember the glove that everyone was excited about that was found 2 miles away?
Yeah.
That would have been a lot easier, probably, right? Because if you wear a glove, there's going to be a lot of sweat and skin cells on the inside of that glove, probably a single contributor. So they could just extract that DNA from the glove, split it, create an STR profile for CODIS, and create a SNP profile for genetic genealogy. So it's possible they're moving forward with investigative genetic genealogy on that sample, right? Because that one was probably not as difficult. And we know they were able to create an STR profile. And so when they didn't get the hit in CODIS, they may have started right away working with that SNP profile. We don't know because it's not something they've released, but it makes sense to me that if that's all they have at the moment to work with, then why wouldn't you at least pursue that, identify that person, and see if in any way, they could be tied to the crime. And so, with the mixture, as we heard, they're obviously struggling to create STR profiles probably and SNP profiles from that mixture, but they're separate. You might be able to create those STR profiles from a mixture and not be able to do it for the SNP profile, or vice versa. We sometimes can work with a mixture and they can't create the STR profile from it. So it's just two completely different types of analysis and techniques. But you also have to remember they've been creating mixture deconvolution software and techniques for decades. Whereas with genetic genealogy and SNP profiles, it's only been not even 8 years that there's been a lot of attention to this. As I said, Parabon scientists were doing it early, but they were, doing something completely different and just so happened that it benefited genetic genealogy later. So people are trying to get up to speed. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a lot of scientists, trying to work on that right now, if they could figure out a way to deconvolute this sample. Obviously, that would be a huge success and mean a lot to a lot of people.
Go ahead.
Okay,
She's
sorry.
fascinating.
I know, and
I've got
a bunch
me.
of
I'm
questions.
sitting here going, yes.
All right, CeCe. So, if the lab in Florida was able to do a SNP profile, we're hypothesizing. We're not saying this is definitely coming. Talk to us about what is necessary to go through for the IgG process if they're able to process it that way.
Okay, well, let's use that glove. Let's go back to that as an example. They probably were able to create a viable SNP profile from that glove. If they decided to move forward with investigative genetic genealogy, if they had reasonable expectation that it could potentially be a person of interest in the case, then they could then upload it to the databases that have allowed law enforcement to compare against them. And so those are the three smallest databases, unfortunately. A lot of people have this misconception. Again, lots of misconceptions with investigative genetic genealogy. They think that we're using Ancestry DNA and 23andMe and MyHeritage, and those companies have all barred law enforcement from using their databases. So despite the fact that over 50 million people have taken direct-to-consumer DNA tests, we are limited to less than 2 million to compare against in violent criminal type cases like this one. Wow. And so they would upload that profile to GEDmatch, and it's only compared against the people that have opted into law enforcement matching, which is approximately a third of that database. They haven't released the numbers in years. It used to be 600,000, maybe it's 700 or 750,000 now. Family tree DNA, on the contrary, opted everybody in and then let them know, and they gave them the option to opt out. So most of their database is available because people are just lazy, right? I mean, they don't opt in, they don't opt out. They go with the default. So there, maybe we have a 1.2 million. And then DNA Justice is the new nonprofit database that I created strictly for this. It only is for solving cases. It's not for genealogy. It's for anyone who wants to help us solve cases, who has taken a DNA test anywhere. They can download their raw data, upload it to GEDmatch. It's still small, but the reason we created it is because the two databases we're allowed to use are owned by private for-profit companies, and they keep raising the amount of money it costs for law enforcement to upload there. And also they could be bought out at any time, or they could change their minds and decide not to work with law enforcement. So, the whole field relies on these two private for-profit companies keeping, the agreement to work with law enforcement, not changing their mind or selling the database and having somebody shut that all down or make it proprietary. So those are the three databases they can use. But a lot of times you're getting really distant matches. So in CODIS, you're looking for that exact person, right? You're looking for that person who left that DNA behind at the crime scene, who has been arrested and or convicted of a crime in the past. And it's different jurisdictions what the law is. Some places, if you are arrested for a violent crime, your DNA is entered into CODIS. Other places you have to actually be convicted. But there are over 20 million profiles in that. And so if this were, a known criminal, someone who has a history with law enforcement for anything violent or really serious, they would probably be in there. They didn't get that. The next step you can do, if the state allows it, is what's called familial searching. And this is often mixed up with investigative genetic genealogy. Familial searching is searching in that law enforcement database, or the databases that law enforcement owns, that is compelled DNA, looking for an immediate relative. So they can look for a first-degree relative, a parent, child, full sibling. Sometimes they can look along, they can use the Y chromosome that men get from their dad's dad to try to find people in the database that match that. But it is limited because they're only using those 20 genetic markers, right? So you're not going to find first cousins, second cousins, and so on. So then if all of that fails, genetic genealogy broadens the search. Now you're searching in databases that is voluntarily contributed DNA. So the laws are different that govern CODIS, because that's DNA people were forced to give. And genetic genealogy consumer databases, people voluntarily gave their DNA. So it's a very different thing. And in there, we are looking for people who just share a portion of their DNA. So match means a very different thing in CODIS as it does in genetic genealogy databases. When they say a match, they found their person. When we say a match, we found a relative, lots of relatives typically, and they can share less than 1% of their DNA and still be significant for us.
And we saw that in the Koberger case, correct?
Yes, the Koberger case was difficult from what I understand, because I built his tree early on when he was first identified to see what they were up against. And 7 of his 8 ancestral lines, great-grandparent lines, were immigrants from Italy. And we have a lot less representation in our databases from people outside of the United States. So if your ancestors have lived here for hundreds of years, you're going to have thousands and thousands of cousins, even in the smaller databases, because your family's been here so long. But if you or your parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents were born outside this country, you're going to have less cousins or matches in those databases, especially the really small ones that we're limited to. If you can get an ancestry, you'll still find a lot of relatives. But in these small databases, you may not find very many. And so the population group of the person we're trying to identify is super important. So Koberger, if he was somebody who had deep roots in the United States on the majority of his ancestral lines, primarily Northwest European ancestry, he probably would have been identified in hours. But it took weeks because he didn't have as many matches as I'm sure they wanted. In that case, as we know from the records, from the hearings, they uploaded surreptitiously to the MyHeritage database, which has about 10 million profiles. So that's probably what solved the case. That's probably where they found the key matches. You can't do that anymore because MyHeritage was very unhappy about that, and they stopped accepting uploads from third parties. So they used to accept a DNA file if you test it anywhere else. And they did this to grow their database because they were the last ones into this field. They didn't start their database till 2016, and the others were all started to 2012 or earlier. So to catch up, they accepted these uploads. If you tested at Ancestry or something, you could upload there. That made them vulnerable to law enforcement using their database, right? Because they could surreptitiously upload a file from a violent criminal and then compare against those 10 million people at MyHeritage that hadn't consented to that. And so that's why there was controversy about that. In that case, it stopped a would-be serial killer, in my opinion. It saved other people from being victimized. So there was a real public interest in public safety, emergent public safety, to stop him. And so they, obviously talked to their superiors and got an exception because the DOJ guidelines do tell them to follow the terms of service of the companies. But it's not illegal, apparently, or at least the judge in that case and others have ruled that law enforcement was allowed to do that. They're allowed to go where the public is allowed to go. That's what's been ruled in the past. And that's why it didn't harm his case, right? They were still able to get a conviction in the end because it wasn't ruled by the judge as fruit of the poison tree, right? Because they weren't, according, at least through his ruling, they didn't do anything illegal. They searched a database against terms of service, but terms of service are not necessarily, the law.
Yeah, violation of the Constitution. And for the audience, fruit of the poisonous tree means any evidence that was collected after a certain point illegally would be suppressed in the court. So that's fascinating. So as an investigator of genetics and genealogy, it's really a fascinating way that you look at things. What do you try to start with, and then how do you go about getting to, from point A to point Z?
Let me just clarify. So that's no longer an option for the Guthrie case. They can't use MyHeritage. They can't use 23andMe or Ancestry because you have to spit in a tube and mail it in. So we would be looking in these small databases, typically for distant cousins. We get excited if we get a second cousin or closer. Second cousins share great grandparents. Most of the time, we're dealing with third, fourth, fifth cousins and even beyond, people who share less than 1% of their DNA. So when we get the match list, they compare all the people in those databases that have allowed law enforcement to compare against their genetic profiles. We get a list of people who share DNA with our unknown subject. In this case, it would be Nancy's kidnapper, or you hope it would be. Those are people that are going to share usually small amounts of their DNA with that unknown person. But the only reason two people will share what we consider significant amounts of DNA, which can be a small amount, is if they have a common ancestor in their tree. You don't just randomly get big chunks of your DNA in common with people unless you have a common ancestor, because you've inherited that DNA from that ancestor. That's why it matches.
Like a mother, father, grandfather, grandparent kind of match, or could
much
be
further back, right? We're not
how
going
many
to
generations typically that you feel comfortable with?
Well, we often build back to the 1700s or 1600s,
Like 5 generations back, 4 or
if
5?
we're lucky, we go 5 generations back, but a lot of the time we're going much further back. But I think I need to clarify, we're not just using one match. We're using a dozen of those matches, or I often will use 3 dozen of those matches.
Okay.
What we're looking for are patterns in the data and triangulations. So I'll build the family trees of the people who share DNA with the unknown suspect, looking for common ancestors. That's ultimately what we're looking for. Because say matches 1, 3, and 5 share DNA with the suspect and with each other. Well, we don't know who he is, but we can figure out who they are, build their family trees. They all must share a common ancestor. So if I can identify their common ancestor, that match cluster, which I call a genetic network, I have one piece of his family tree, that suspect, and he has to be a descendant from that ancestor as well, or usually it's an ancestral couple. And so I'm usually trying to connect to both sides of someone's family tree. If matches 1, 3, and 5 are my first genetic network sharing DNA with each other, then maybe matches 2, 4, and 6 share DNA with each other as well. And they don't share DNA with that first cluster. That's my second genetic network. I should be able to identify a second set of common ancestors. So now I have 2 pieces of his family tree. I have to find someone descended from ancestor number 1 and ancestor number 2, typically through a marriage, sometimes an out of wedlock birth, which makes it harder. But we're lucky if there's a marriage record and we can see that union couple, or I call it triangulation, but a lot of people call it a union couple, that brings all of those ancestors we've identified into one family tree and makes all of those people at the top of the match list related to this one immediate family. If I can connect some of the matches to mom's side and some to dad's side, I know exactly which immediate family our suspect comes from. He has to be below that marriage or that union couple. And so if that is a very recent coupling or marriage, we know it has to be one of their sons. So if they have one son, we're good to go. If they have 2, 3, 4, it could be any of them because they all have the same family tree. So then you start looking at other aspects that you would traditionally look at in an investigation: location, age, criminal history, association with the victim or any of their known associates, that kind of thing, to further try to narrow it down. So sometimes we have to say there's 4 brothers, like the St. George case. There were 8 children in that family, 4 males. So I could only say it's one of these 4. But it has to be one of these 4 because we all have unique family trees. And I had connected to all 4 of his grandparents' ancestral lines. And so nobody else would have that exact same family tree and set of ancestors. So that showed me it had to be one of those brothers. And then it was Detective Wilson's job to figure out which one, which he did very quickly.
So, and so do you also go into like let's say you narrow it down, are you able to, like you were talking about criminal history and stuff, are you going into archival, archives of sorts and saying, hey, this person in the past had A, B, C, and D. He looks like a better candidate for the investigators. Because you're both running side by side with each other. It's fascinating.
And to that point, CeCe, are the police and investigators willing to open up their file and share information about this person, whoever the case is about, in order to help you do your end?
Or do you want to?
It totally depends on the detective I'm working with and the agency I'm working with. Some are very, hold all the information tight to the vest and don't share anything with me. And I can do it blind as long as I know where and when. I need to know where the crime occurred and when it occurred, because I need to know where I'm trying to get that tree to. Like, just like real estate, location, location, location is super important in investigative genetic genealogy. I'm always trying to find the branches of the tree that come closer to the location of the crime. I mean, occasionally we'll have a long haul trucker, but 99% of the time plus, we end up finding someone within a few miles, sometimes within a mile or house or a few houses from the crime scene. And so I can do it just from that. But there are often important clues. If they share with us, it can help solve a case. We had a case in Detroit that one of my colleagues worked in. I have a really small team at Parabon, but one of my colleagues, Christine, worked that case. And in the file, it said it was a multiple rape case. So it was a serial rapist. And one of the victims said that she thought she saw her rapist from her backyard. So like catty corner, somebody else's backyard. And we didn't have a lot of great matches because it was an African-American case. But when Christine was working the case, she found someone who lived on the adjacent street a few doors down in that family. He was among the descendants. So she gave that to law enforcement as kind of a Hail Mary. And guess what? It was him. If he had not shared that information with her, if that detective had not shared that, she would have just had to give him this huge list of descendants, because when you don't have as many matches to work with, you might only be able to identify one branch of someone's family tree. And then say you've got the great-great-grandparents, they might have 2,000 descendants if it was a big family, which a lot of them were back then. And so you're following all those lines forward, trying to find your person. So sometimes having a clue from the file can be really, really helpful, but we don't always get it. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We don't have any law enforcement access. Everything we work with is public information. We just know how to make the most of it. Like, we don't have, people think we have special access. We don't. Anybody can access the records we use: census records, birth records, marriage records, death records. But you mentioned archival, and that's super important. We work with newspaper archives extensively. We will often find crimes in there that law enforcement doesn't even have in their databases because they're so old. So there's been a lot of cases where it appeared they didn't have a criminal record. But then when I dug through the newspapers, I found all kinds of crimes that they had been accused of or even convicted of back in, say, the 70s or the 80s that were not coming up on law enforcement's radar. So we have tools and techniques they don't, and they have tools and techniques we don't. So when we give them a name or names, they'll then have their intelligence agents, their intelligence analysts,
right,
think a lot like genetic genealogists, but have law enforcement tools then to expand on that. So a lot of times I'll give them a lot of information in my report, and then their analyst finds other information I couldn't access. And so it works really well together. So a lot of the intelligence analysts have asked, like, how did you find that? Where did you find that? And they're starting to use genealogical archives more in their work as well.
Wow, that's great. I mean, you just, so much of what you just shared, my brain's trying to absorb. The piece where you said location, location, location. Tell us again, CeCe, did you say 90% or 99%, a huge amount of cases, or I should say most cases where you're looking for a suspect, they commit the crime, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, they commit the crime, they're from the area where they're committing their heinous crime.
Yes.
Tell us that again.
That St. George case that I mentioned, again, I'll come back to that. All of the matches families were based on the East Coast. Everything I was building was East Coast, East Coast, East Coast, but I needed to get somebody who came to St. George. So I kept looking, like, are any of these descendants from this family adventurous? And I found one adventurous child out of 12 in one family and followed them west, and then kept coming west. And I finally landed in St. George. So it's often if all the trees I'm building are in a completely different location than where the crime is, I'm often looking for that adventurous descendant who makes a move. But if all the trees I'm building are right by the crime scene, I know it's someone who has deep roots in that area, and it's harder, right? Because there's a lot more descendants that are living right there. So that can be a hugely helpful part of my research. Also, where their ancestors are from in the world. So if all your ancestors are from Finland, then I got to find someone whose family never married outside of the Finnish population group. But if you're 10% African and 5% Native American and 10% Italian and the rest is like English or German, then I can, as I'm building forward, I can say, okay, this family has English roots. I need to find someone who married someone from a different population group. And then when I find that, who are their descendants? Who did they marry and have children with? Did they marry someone from one of these different population groups? So you can kind of weave it together if you've got somebody with a unique ancestral mix. And that has also been the key in a lot of my cases. So it's location, both where your match's families are from, but also location where their ancestors are from.
All right, let me ask you this. Do you think in the Nancy Guthrie case, the person who did this, the perpetrator of the crime against Nancy, is from the Tucson area?
I do, but that includes south of the border, right? It's not that far, an hour and a half. So that's concerning if the theories are correct, that it may have been someone who came from across the border, because we have less representation in our databases again. So if you're trying to identify someone that was born in, say, Mexico, it's going to be more difficult. One, because we don't have as many people in the database with that ancestral background. And two, because you have to work with records in a different country and a different language. Now, I will say they have great genealogical records. Sometimes their birth records list the grandparents and the marriage records too, which that doesn't happen in the US.
And in the churches too, right? Down there, the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah. It's because of the Catholic Church records. So they have great records if you can read them. You know, you have to be able to read the script, the old script, and read in Spanish, which we certainly have people who can do that. One of my closest colleagues on my team at Parabon is an expert on Latin American genetic genealogy. She can read all those records. She's super familiar with it. They have different naming patterns as well, where they pass down the mother's surname as well. So you have to know all of that to be able to work those cases. It can be done, but it's more difficult. The other problem is even if he is not from Mexico, but his parents were born there, or his grandparents, or even his great grandparents, he will be more difficult to identify than someone, again, who has really deep roots in the US with primarily Northwest European ancestry, English, German. Like those are the people that we have in our database, people whose ancestors came here 200 years ago or 300 years ago. And so that could make it more difficult. It's all speculation though, because we don't know. We can't tell with what he was wearing, right? I mean, we have no idea other than, he looked like he was white. Looked like it. It's hard to tell, but didn't look like somebody with really dark skin. But beyond that, I don't think we can tell much.
So you get the DNA hypothetical, right? Let's just mess around here.
I like where you're going, Chris.
Okay, you get the DNA. It's coming across, and it's your case now. What are you doing? Walk us through it.
So I am going to, assuming it's already been uploaded to the databases, I'm looking at my match lists, and I'm then creating those genetic networks I mentioned. I don't build the trees match 1, match 2, match 3, match 4. I build the trees of the people who share DNA with each other on that match list, because I'm looking for those patterns. A lot of this is pattern recognition, right? I'm going to hope those trees go back to the same geographic area, and hopefully eventually I start seeing the same surnames in their trees, and then hopefully the same common ancestors.
You're a great mom. Your kids didn't have a chance.
So I would say, and the other thing people don't know is that there's not usually family tree information. So I have to identify that top match first. And usually there's an email address and a name, but the name could be super common, or it can be an alias. Like people will put Butterfly 47. I've got to figure out who the hell is Butterfly 47 that is sharing 2% of their DNA with my unknown suspect. Right? So they're either second cousins to third cousins. I need to build back to their great grandparents and their great great grandparents. But first I got to figure out who they are. So we use reverse email lookups a lot, because that's the information we have.
Are those very helpful? I always wonder if those are very helpful.
They're amazingly helpful, and we couldn't do our work without it. And there are less and less databases that offer it. So it's kind of scary. because if we didn't have that, it would be extremely difficult to identify anyone other than someone with a really unique name. Some people on the list will have a name that no one else in the US has, or maybe there's 5 people with that name. So I just build all 5 trees, and whichever one seems to be connecting with the other matches, I know, okay, it's this guy because he's got common ancestors with match number 5, for instance, or he's in the right geographic location where these other trees are. And so that can take a lot of time. That is one part of our work that could be more automated, and that people could help us if they upload their family tree. So you can upload your raw data, your genetic data, to GEDmatch and Family Tree and DNA Justice, but you can also provide your family tree information, but most people don't. So if you did that, you would save me a lot of time, sometimes hours and hours of trying to identify who owns this email address, who owns this DNA. And sometimes one person on GEDmatch will manage 50 kits. So it's not even their DNA. I can figure out who they are, but I've got to figure out who are they related to or associated with, whose initials are AB, because that's all I have on there. So that is one area where perhaps AI could help, right? People always ask me, can AI do your job? No, not the whole job, but there are pieces of our job that I think could be faster. When we're trying to, once we identify that person whose DNA is matching our suspect, who are their parents? Well, we're using people search databases like Ben Verified, for instance, or White Pages Premium. We're looking for obituaries, right, that name that person. If I can see someone on the relative list or the associate list on Ben Verified who's deceased, I can go look for their obituary to see if that person is named in that. And sometimes there's public family trees out there too, but we can't see living people typically on public family trees. So the key is kind of finding a deceased person. Is their parent deceased? Is their grandparent deceased? Sometimes we have to go back to great grandparent, depending on their age, to find that deceased relative. And then we can start connecting into the traditional genealogical records, like census records. We only have up to 1950 because they're private for 72 years. So we're hoping to find someone born before 1950 that we can find in the census and then connect to their parents, and then keep stepping back in the census records and keep connecting to that person's parents. And then, who were their parents? And we can go all the way back in the census records. Usually 1850 is about where they're still useful. When you get back before that, it's only the head of the family that's listed. And then there's just check marks for like how many children and things. So typically we can, go back to 1850 pretty well and build those trees back. But, if somebody family or ancestors are outside the country, that stops. Or if they are African-American, we get stuck at that 1870 census, because if they're descended from enslaved individuals, which not all African-Americans are, but ones that are descended from enslaved individuals, they weren't listed by name before.
Were you aware that they, in South Carolina, they opened up, what was the museum? What's it called? The African-American Slave Museum.
I think it's the International African-American Museum.
And they put a genealogical center in the museum.
Yeah, I think that's the one that my colleague has an exhibition at. So
Yeah,
I've also worked on
we were back in South Carolina when that was getting built.
Is it in Charlotte?
It's in Charleston.
Charleston.
Yeah, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry. I meant Charleston.
To your point, right?
Yeah, I think that's where it is. I think the 2 lead genealogists for Finding Your Roots have an exhibition there, I believe. A coastal.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I apologize. But
oh, no, that's fine. So, it should be a conversation. I'm kind of, lecturing. But
it's not.
No,
it's
you're fine.
fascinating.
You're great.
We'll jump in, but
yeah.
I did. And that's the thing. It's not only census records. People often say you can't trace African-American families that descend from enslaved people further back, but we do it all the time on Finding Your Roots.
Sure.
You have to use different resources like wills and other types of records, slave narratives. There's all kinds of records you can use. So it's not just that, but we're building these trees as fast as we can and as efficiently as we can. And we're using what's digitized online. We can't fly to South Carolina and then the next day fly to Florida and then fly, then go over to Tennessee. Like, these trees are all over the place. So we're relying on records primarily that have been digitized and put online. And we're fortunate that there are billions of those now. And so we're sitting behind our laptops or computers for dozens of hours, working these cases. That's not to say we won't sometimes call a library or ask somebody to go to a location. There's still a lot in dusty basements at courthouses that hasn't been digitized, and other types of records. A lot of people have very valuable genealogical records in their possession that have been passed down in their family. We're seeing a lot of those, being scanned and put on trees that say Ancestry, or being sent to Family Search, for instance. But there's still a lot of information we cannot get to. But when we're working these cases, it's often a race against time. And so we, even on cold cases, so we are, really reliant on what is online primarily.
So go ahead.
No, so Chris was asking, okay, if the Nancy Guthrie case ended up on your desk with what we know of the DNA samples, you just kind of laid out all the different avenues and how you would start your detective work to try to figure out through IgG relatives, right? I want to be paraphrasing this accurately, right? In order to get to who the suspect is.
Yes. So I say this often, we're reverse engineering the family tree of the suspect piece by piece based on who he's sharing DNA with. So ancestor by ancestor, we're piecing his tree back together. We don't know who he is, but we do know, or we can figure out who these people are that he's sharing DNA with. So they're known individuals, or at least we're hoping we can figure out. Sometimes we can't figure out our top match, but the vast majority of the time we can. And so we can build their family trees, and that's telling us, look, they share DNA with him. They have to share a portion of their tree. There has to be a branch of their tree in common. Our job is to figure out which branch, and then to figure out how all of those branches come together. I've got this branch over here from my first genetic network. I've got a branch over here from my second genetic network. Maybe I'm lucky and I have 3 and 4 genetic networks, which I did on the St. George case. I know each of those is probably going to represent one of his grandparents' lines, or at least one of his great grandparents. And so I'm building forward now. So traditionally in genealogy, we build backward, right? We're trying to find long dead ancestors, get further and further back. But what we're doing now is flipping the tree upside down, coming forward, trying to find living people or recently living people. And so it's called descendancy research, or I call it reverse genealogy. So we're not doing what traditional genealogy has done. We are at the beginning, but then what we're doing is unique. And really what laid the foundation for this is unknown parentage research, finding people's biological families. That was the first time we were really doing this reverse genealogy, when we were looking at the descendants of people's ancestors, not just going back in time.
So what kind of pitfalls do you think? I mean, and I know you're not working this case, but there was this a lot of blowback onto the sheriff because he sent it down to the lab in Florida. I thought that was all noise.
Well, let me also say the FBI does not have in-house capability to create a SNP profile for genetic genealogy. So if he had sent it to them, they would have then had to turn around and send part of that DNA to a third-party lab.
To their lab, right, to a third party that they contract with.
That's exactly right. And that's what they did in Koberger's case. The crime lab in Idaho created the STR profile, and then they sent the DNA out to a third-party private lab. And
that was Othram, right?
Exactly. So you can do that pretty quickly, but by sending all of the DNA to the lab he's worked with for years, he's had a contract, the agency has had a contract with DNA Labs International for a long time. He knew everything would be done in one place and it would be done professionally because he's had successes with them before. So this wasn't just some random lab he decided to send it to. They have a track record with him and with many, many other law enforcement agencies across the world.
Yeah, and unfortunately that noise got tied up into the media and it just kind of went off the rails. But it's still at that lab. It's DNA International.
It is. I have to comment. Somebody said CeCe should open her own DNA bank where people.
She does have a lab.
She does.
I have one. DNAjustice.org.
And we're going to put that.
The link
it's going to be in the link
description
below after this.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
So
you're good.
And can they upload their databases to you? right? You said
You mean their profile?
Their profiles?
Yeah, DNA Labs International, once they create the SNP profile, they can either perform the genetic genealogy, and they have a great lead genetic genealogist, or the FBI can take that SNP profile and take over, because they also have a fantastic investigative genetic genealogy team. And in a case like this, where time is of the essence, I would think that's probably what they would do, because they have resources that we don't have as independent genetic genealogists. And if it does turn out to be someone who has more recent immigrant roots, they can access all those immigration records and things that we can't. For instance, on the Faith Hedgepeth case out of Chapel Hill, North Carolina, we worked that for years, and we knew it was an immigrant, and probably a very recent immigrant based on the matches. And we finally partnered with the FBI. We were working on it and they were working on it. They were pulling immigration records and talking to family members. That's how we finally solved it. You know, for years we were building trees, and I think it was Guatemala, if I'm remembering correctly. It was, I think, a Central American country. And we needed the FBI's resources, you know, to be able to track some of that immigration. It turned out being somebody who was actually born in another country and had immigrated here, and they were able to find his immigration records, which we wouldn't have access to as independent genetic genealogists. So I think it's very likely that the FBI will do the investigative genetic genealogy, like they did in Koberger's case, for instance. It started with Othram, but then it was taking too long to find him. So the FBI team took that over, and then they were the ones that identified Brian Koberger.
Through the two cousins.
What was that?
Through the two other family members that.
Well, we don't actually know. We don't know what kind of matches they found, but they found him. His Koberger line has been in the United States for a long time. So I think, you know, it's likely they found a match on that line, and that's such an unusual surname. But then they would have also found all those Italian matches, right? So they would have been looking for a Koberger descendant from however far back they built that married into, I think, exclusively Italian families. And they did it, you know, pretty quickly once they took over.
Very interesting. All right, let me ask you this. So based on what we know with the Nancy Guthrie case, do you feel like the DNA could help solve this case?
I do, but I don't know whether it will be from the home, the original crime scene, or it would be after they find a second crime scene. Like, I don't know if anyone's been following the mistaken identity kidnapping of a grandfather in Australia. He was taken from his home. It was mistaken identity, as I said, or at least they believe it was. And I'm surprised no one's been talking about it, because it's so similar to Nancy's case. In that case, they found a secondary location where he had been held. And unfortunately, recently they found him deceased. But if they were to find something like that in Nancy's case, maybe she was alive. Hopefully she still is. But if they held her for a while, there could be a location where she was held that is discovered that might have a plethora of DNA.
Right.
Or if she is no longer with us, when they finally find her body might have a source of perpetrator's DNA. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be DNA from the initial crime scene, but I do believe that DNA will eventually help solve the case. There's other ways they could. Someone might come forward and collect that reward, right? But if they don't, eventually, yes, investigative genetic genealogy, if they have the DNA from the perpetrator, he will be identified through investigative genetic genealogy if nothing else has solved the case. But the big if right now is, do they have his DNA? We don't know.
Right. We have video of the suspect on the front porch, but we don't know that that's his DNA inside the house.
Yeah, that's why one of the things that I'm always, you know, a straight shooter. I didn't understand why that welcome mat is still on that porch when there's video of that guy standing on that, when you could probably, you know, pull a MVAC on that thing and, you know, do the Bardot method and then send it to somebody like you, and you guys can do your thing and chase that in every direction. And, you know, I had a caper many years ago where the evidence gal, and if you're listening, Cheryl, you forgive me, even to this day, there was a turd in the toilet. And I said, grab a swab on the turd. And she looked at me, she goes, really? I
We
said,
solved a case like that too, Chris.
yeah, and this was an evisceration. She had been dismembered. It was a crazy case. And long story short, she did it. Cheryl did it. And we, as a team, we solved that case. And it was, a family member that was distant. But it takes that, those minutia, very small things to put into hands like professionals like yourself. And off the record here, when we're done, we got to get you into the Cold Case Foundation, because we have about almost 187 experts from around the world, and we're working a lot of cases behind the scenes. And so after we're done, remind me, to have that conversation, because we could really, your skill set is unbelievable.
It's so funny you mentioned that, though, because we've had a case, same as you just mentioned. Also, we had one where someone spit in the toilet. So I was so hoping they'd find something like that in Nancy's case. And it looked like he had that bite flashlight in his mouth. When he leaned forward to disable the camera, it's very likely saliva would have fallen on that cement there. So hopefully they swabbed that. Also, when he took it out of his mouth, if he was there 40 minutes, like it appears, he wouldn't have kept that in his mouth for 40 minutes. So he would have touched his own saliva. And when he took that camera out, and then his gloves would have had his DNA on them, right? You wear gloves so you don't leave your DNA. But if you touch your face or you touch your mouth or you get saliva from a flashlight, you now have that DNA on your hands and you're going to transfer it somewhere. So I'm actually really surprised that we haven't heard that they have a better profile for him, because if he was there 40 minutes and there was clearly some altercation because Nancy was bleeding, she may have fought back, something happened. How do they not have his DNA? Maybe they're just not telling us, and what he's releasing.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah, because it's almost impossible not to leave your DNA behind at an intimate type violent crime scene, which we know there had to have been some violence, at least something, for her to be bleeding. Even if you're, all suited up like he was. Kohberger, for instance, was as well, and he forgot something. But even just a hair, we can solve cases now with one single rootless hair, thanks to the brilliant Dr. Ed Green of UC Santa Cruz. And so how do you not leave anything? I just think there had to have been something left behind. We have to trust that the crime scene investigators were thorough and collected everything. But that's why I'm hoping there's still evidence being processed, because in a crime scene like that, I would think there'd be so many swabs collected, so many different pieces of physical evidence that could later be tested. They could use MVAX on it. Chris, I'm sure you're familiar with MVAX, right? So hopefully something is going to come up. But I need to comment to somebody in the thread, in the comment, said BK is German, Brian Kohberger. His father's line, Kohberger, is German, but the rest of his tree is Italian. Go build it. You'll see. Actually, a lot of people have built it now. You can see if you go to ancestry.com, there's a lot of people who've built his tree. It's Italian. It was actually really difficult to build, but like his mom's side is full Italian and his dad's mom's side is also Italian. So it's largely Italian immigrants back 100 years or so ago. And that's what make his genetic genealogy more difficult.
Wow. CeCe, I want to go back to something Chris just mentioned. Again, it's a hypothetical, but the doormat that we saw in front of Nancy's house on the video, we saw the perp standing on that doormat. You were just mentioning the bite light in his mouth. Perhaps some saliva could have dripped out, landed on the mat. I know it's speculative, but from your eyes and as the expert you are, what could be gleaned if that mat was taken first hour, day one? What kind of, for lack of a better way to say it, DNA sweep on that? What could you do to try to get anything from the perp off of that doormat had it been collected?
It would more likely just be something from the bottom of his shoe, which could be tracked from his home potentially, or his car. Maybe he's got a dog or a cat or something. There might have been something, some sort of, I know carpet fibers have been, that analysis, a lot of people are saying is not correct anymore, but still, okay, if there was like blue carpet fiber, that could be helpful. If there was dog hair from a certain breed of dog, anything, Chris, any
the
tiny,
best witnesses are dogs.
yeah, can lead to that. So I think it's unlikely that it would have his DNA on it unless he tracked it from his car or his home. I don't think it was right under the camera, was it?
Yeah, he stood on it.
But
he stood on it.
Okay, well then maybe it did have saliva on it, and they could do MVAC on it, or they could just swab the surface of it. But it's going to have a lot of contamination. So we deal with contamination a lot in cases, because how long has she had that, Matt? 5 years, 1 year, even weeks? You've got all kinds of people tracking debris, from their shoes, and maybe animals too in the area that she lives. So there's no guarantee that could. I'd be more interested in something inside the house when he presumably took out that flashlight. It just seems hard to believe there isn't anything there. So I'm just going to keep hoping. I know that the lab knows what they're doing. So if they've been given that evidence, they will find it. But because she lived alone, I think it's hard to rule out everybody that could be contamination. Of course, they know her closest friends, her family members, the people that regularly worked at the house, but they probably don't know every single person she has had in that house in the last 10 years. And we've worked plenty of cases where we work really hard. They spend a lot of money, and we identify the DNA contributor, and it's someone who lived in the home 2 years earlier or 5 years earlier, or, somebody that just nobody ever thought of to rule out, a former boyfriend or something. A lot of times, people just forget. They don't remember every single person that has come in their home. Now, of course, she's lived there for many years. If we could ask her, she could tell us. But I doubt, Annie wasn't there 24/7. She doesn't know every single worker or person, visitor that her mom had, I wouldn't think. So we just don't know until we know, right? I mean, you can start trying to identify those DNA contributors, and then it's really just a lead. And that's always true for genetic genealogy. We can give them the DNA contributor or the likely DNA contributor from that evidence, but we can't say that's the suspect. They then have to go and say, could this person be our suspect? Of course, if it was mixed blood, fresh, that would have been highly likely to be the suspect. Or in rape cases, if it's semen, it's a good chance, if you've ruled out the boyfriends. So, or any known partners. But with transfer DNA, or what's commonly called touch DNA, starts getting a lot more difficult to jump to conclusions and a lot more dangerous. As the sensitivity of our equipment and technology has increased, the caution used needs to also increase, right? Because we leave DNA everywhere. We transfer DNA. Yeah. And so just because they identify somebody as a DNA contributor to that crime scene does not mean that person is the suspect. So there's a long way to go, even if they do identify one or more people from those DNA samples.
Let's go back to inside Nancy's house. We know.
Let me answer this real fast.
Oh, okay.
I hope not that the infighting, if there is any going on behind the scenes, clogs that wheel. So that's a great comment, but I'm not seeing that just yet. And I think we all agree here that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. And I think early on, the sheriff got a couple of hits that were, for him, I'm not going to say everything was, hunky-dory and roses and all that other stuff. There were some mistakes made, but that aside, the feds are involved. They're working together. And I really do believe at some point this case it's going to hit a turn, even though they're pulling back resources because of gals like CeCe and guys who are out there working their butts off to narrow this down. So that's it.
So CeCe, I wanted just to talk for a minute about the DNA that professionals, experts like you have to rely on what was swabbed inside the home and the crime scene. Mm-hmm. And if for example, doorknob was missed and not swabbed, then obviously you can't do your work. So
Right.
we are
totally reliant on the crime scene investigation.
You're so right. And so if things weren't, if, everything was, to Chris's point, look, investigators going in the bathroom, looking at the toilet, seeing if there's anything possible to swab of somebody that would have been in Nancy's house for 41 minutes at that time of night. And we know that investigators went back multiple times to Nancy's house as recently as just a couple days ago. So if they're continuing to, and maybe this is wishful thinking, and again, this is a hypothesis. I'm just talking. I'm not trying to speculate, but if they continue to gather, not just on day one, and then we saw they turned the crime scene, they turned Nancy's house back over, and then they said, oops, we have to go back in and do more evidence gathering. If that went on, one would think that they would be collecting additional potential DNA evidence or biological information or biological evidence, as the sheriff put it, to test. So we're not just getting stuff that, let's say, investigators swabbed inside Nancy's home on day one, but we know they were back, whatever it was, day 3 or 5, continuing forward. So does that increase the chance of trying to get better quality DNA sample to test and to work backwards on if they've made multiple trips back to the crime scene inside the house?
Sure. I mean, because they know if the family was allowed in there, they'd have their DNA, right? So they can always eliminate them. If there were investigators in there, hopefully they were fully suited up. But even if they weren't, they can eliminate their DNA. So DNA is resilient. It could very well still be in that house and able to be collected, days, weeks, months later, as long as there aren't a bunch of people traipsing through, right, that are unknown. And so there's been plenty of cases where the DNA had been there a long time, and yet it still was used to solve the case. So people are really worried about that, thinking the DNA is not going to stay. It's going to stay if it's there, as long as, it's not tracked over or, people are just not completely unprofessional, which I can't imagine that they would be. And so I'm not as worried about that. Like I said, DNA is very resilient, but I do really hope that they were very careful looking for hair, because there are so many cases where all they have is rootless hair. And those are the ones that we've, now been able to solve. That's the newest development in investigative genetic genealogy, and really just in investigations, criminal investigations, is the ability to use that. And, even if you have shorter hair, it's really common you're going to lose some of it. And he was suited up, but we saw it looked like he had some facial hair potentially. And we don't know if he left that on the whole time he was in there or not. I mean, if he was in there 40 minutes, we don't know what happened, right? During those 40 minutes. We don't know, did he use a faucet? Did he use the toilet? Did he flush the toilet? Did he touch anything? Did he touch her bedside table? I think there's still just a really good chance that their DNA is in that home, and hopefully they have collected it. And if they haven't, they'll go back and continue swabbing things and searching the floor for that hair. I don't know if it was carpeted in there or not, but I'm really hoping.
Yeah, and
they could see, could find it.
No, I'm hoping that she had carpet in her bedroom.
Mm-hmm.
I know that homes in the Southwest often have tile floors because it's so hot.
Right.
But yeah,
Which would be
we
fine.
know she had curtains. Well, we believe that was her room. There were curtains from her back slider in that room. So
someone said, did he even go in the home? Well, I guess we don't know, but based on what happened, it sure seems like he must have gone in the home.
Well, we know she was taken from her bed. So somebody went in there and took her out of her bedroom.
Well, we've heard some people say that, but it hasn't really been confirmed. And at one point, the sheriff said, I didn't mean that. I was just assuming. I wasn't being careful with my words. But then we heard Savannah say she was taken from her bed. So, we don't know what we don't know, but I think he almost certainly went in. I mean, there's been some speculation he knocked on the door and she opened the door. But even if that happened, I would think he would have pushed her back into the home, because he was there a long time. I don't think he was standing on the doorstep for 40 minutes.
Yeah, and she wore high-powered Hearing aids, I don't think she heard it. She heard him.
Yeah, someone said MVAX for the rugs. Absolutely. MVAX have been amazing. But, there'd be a lot to sort through if you MVAC the rugs. And I don't know when she last had them cleaned or vacuumed. I mean, all of these variables matter. But, there's a lot you can do, a lot. And more as time goes by.
Let me grab some of these questions here.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Do they try to separate out Nancy's DNA first if it's part of the combination?
Yes. Which should be fairly straightforward. They have her DNA from the blood, if nowhere else. So yeah, that's what they would do.
In this day and age, isn't there some sort of tech that can identify someone via their eyes? Thank you, Beth Pepper's Coat.
Their eyes?
Yeah, there is a technology that is out there for the iris. It's called an iris scan, but you have to be in the system. And what you're noticing now, and it's an opt-out system for facial recognition. If you go to TSA and you fly, it is the same type of system, and it's connected to various databases in the National Crime Information Center pipeline. Jason, CeCe, the websites which do not cooperate with LE, can a warrant be used to force them to provide the DNA collected? For the websites that do cooperate with LE, can a warrant force the members who opted out?
Yes and yes. So there's a lot of people that talk about genetic privacy that say get a warrant. So yeah, law enforcement can get a warrant. They've been trying to play nice and not alienate the public and the managers of these databases. But yeah, they absolutely can get a warrant, and they will very soon. I don't know if it'll be this case or another, but I strongly believe that law enforcement will soon serve a warrant on the big databases, especially the ones based here in the US, like Ancestry and 23andMe. They have deep pockets. I think there may be, especially with Ancestry, a knockdown, drag out fight. So it might take a couple of weeks to have a hearing. Based on legal experts I've spoken to, it sounds very unlikely that the databases will be able to keep law enforcement out, because there's already been rulings in the past about not being able to keep law enforcement out where the public is allowed. I'm not a legal expert, but I've talked to some very smart people. I know the arguments that are going to be made, and I think it's very likely to happen. If they hadn't identified the person who attempted to assassinate Trump or the Charlie Kirk murderer, I think it would have been then, but they found them through other methods. So a high profile case like one of those, or Nancy's, could very well be the one where they finally decide to serve those warrants. And I think if in a case like Nancy's, where it's a race against time and there's so much public interest and support, I think it'd be a very bad PR move to fight it. But I think that they may feel they have to at least appear to be protecting their customers' data. But if you look at Google, for instance, we've heard about these Google searches that were made, right? Nancy's address and how much Savannah's salary. How do you think they got that data? They served a warrant and they got that data. So the genetic genealogy companies, should not necessarily be different than any other technology company that is forced to turn over private information for people. And they do it every day. I mean, the FBI and law enforcement serve those types of warrants every day for cell phone information, for search histories, for all kinds of things, for bank records. And there's something called genetic exceptionalism, where people act like DNA information is different. That's arguable. You might think it is, you might think it's not. But if they can pull your search history, your email correspondence, your bank records, all of that, that's all personal too, right? And so can you argue that genetic information that you voluntarily provided to a private company is different? I guess we'll see.
Well, what's fascinating about that point, and I think we're past the point of no return in terms of now the question is, okay, what do we do with the data that these companies get? And if you can't trust law enforcement, then we've got a lot of problems going forward. But just think about this. When you go to the happiest place on earth, i.e. Disneyland, Disney World, where any of these theme parks, what's the one thing they want? You now have to put your fingerprint there. Okay. Where do you think that is going? It's going to a private database, and at some point that is going to be sold to a data broker. And that data broker is going to provide that information for cash to somebody somewhere. And when law enforcement comes around with a search warrant and says, hey, we'd like to get into that database, okay, that company typically will provide it. So we are already at a place where I agree with CeCe 1,000%. I mean, Karen and I are both, we've done our DNA. Mine came back to aliens from outer space. Karen is actually much more level set than me. But I guess the point being is really these databases and companies like CeCe, the work that they're doing is they're not only bringing perpetrators to justice, but the whole reason I started with Savannah tonight and listened to her plea, they're bringing peace to those families. And there is nothing like seeing a family once you get to lean over, and I know you've done this many times, and they say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And you realize, we were just a small chip in a very large bag. But we played a very small role. But for them, it's a life-changing role. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
So there's a few points I don't want to forget as you were talking. I was thinking of one is if someone wants your DNA, they can get it. They'll just follow you and you leave your DNA everywhere. So
that's a good point. We saw that in the Huerman case.
Yeah, they got it off a pizza box.
Yeah. So, and they do that in my cases too. Once I've given them a potential identification, they collect surreptitious DNA because they can't arrest someone based on a genetic genealogy analysis. So they have to then go and get DNA from that candidate or candidates that I am, pointing them towards through the investigative genetic genealogy before they can arrest. And then they can take DNA directly. But in order to be able to get that arrest warrant, they have to go get usually surreptitious DNA from that individual. So they do it all the time. And so people that are concerned their DNA is going to be used from, say, Ancestry, well, if anyone cares that much about your DNA, they'll get it one way or another. Secondly, I think these companies are ignoring the fact that long-term studies have showed that 91% of the public is, at least, that's what they're finding. 2 different studies or 3 different studies have found about 91% support using investigative genetic genealogy for violent criminal cases. And so if most of the public supports it and wants it, why don't these companies create an opt-in, opt-out, just like GEDmatch, where their customers now get a choice? Because I have people writing me all the time who say, I want to help you with your cases, so I tested at Ancestry. Well, I have to write back and say, we can't access that. And they have no idea. So why not create a button, just like GEDmatch does, or a checkbox that says, I want to help law enforcement solve these cases. I'm okay with them comparing against my data. And the other thing is that you said we're like a chip in a chip box or a chip bag, right? That's true in these cases too. It's not one match that solves it. It's a whole network of matches. As I mentioned earlier, it might be a dozen, it might be 3 dozen. Yeah, so it's not on any one person. I mean, occasionally we'll get a close relative, but the vast majority of the time, it is, a handful of 3rd cousins and 4th cousins that all converge to this one person's identity. So it's not like it's all on this one person because they shared their DNA.
Great point. And Kelly Thompson asked, what about people who are adopted? How can you trace them and family history? That's a great question. Thank you.
Great question. And earlier I meant to mention it when you said, what could some of the challenges be? It's not just population group. It's also adoptees and people who have misattributed parentage, usually paternity. And it can also be at their parents' level or grandparents' level, right? So if their mom's dad is not who it is on paper, we're missing a 1/3 of the tree, or a 1/4 of the tree, sorry. So fortunately, all of us that do this work, that work with me at least, have deep experience and history in working adoption cases. and misattributed paternity cases. Because, by the way, millions of people who took these consumer DNA tests for fun found out their father was not their biological father, or one of their parents' fathers was not their biological father. And so we've dealt with this a lot. So we're really, really familiar with it. When I'm first working on someone's tree, I can almost always go ding, 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 this person is adopted, or this person's father must not be their father, just from all those years of working those types of cases. But it really does complicate our work, because often our top matches, our top match or multiple of our top matches are adopted or have their own significant identity mystery. And that's why they're in GEDmatch, because GEDmatch was created for the more advanced genetic genealogists. Two friends of mine started it, Curtis Rogers and John Olson, way back. And it was really like this sandbox for us advanced genetic genealogists to play around in. So to even have your DNA in there, you have to be really invested in genetic genealogy. And so a big percentage of people in GEDmatch have a very significant family mystery. They are adopted, or one of their parents is, or so on. And so we run into a much higher number of people who have these family history mysteries. That's a tongue twister. Than the normal population, right? If we just had a random cross section of DNA from the population, we might run into that, whatever the percentage would be of the time. But in GEDmatch, it's biased towards people with those mysteries. So we so often have adoptees at the top of our match list or throughout our top matches. And we often have to solve their adoption, identify their biological parents before we can then use them in the case. Now, sometimes we just leave that one out. Like if I'm building my genetic network and matches 1, 3, 5, and 7 share DNA, but matches 3's tree doesn't connect to any of the others, I might just go with 1, 5, and 7 if I can find their common ancestor. But if they're our top match and we don't have much else to work with, or our 3 top matches are adopted, which I've had, we've got to do something. So on GEDmatch, we can see their matches. So we can just solve it sometimes just like that. But in other cases, we have to reach out, and we try not to reach out. But sometimes we got to reach out and say, have you figured out who your biological parents are? And if they say no, we say, well, do you want us to do it? Like, we'll do it. That's what we're super experienced in. Or I can get one of my DNA detective volunteers to do that. So that's really common. Fortunately, as I said, we're really experienced at it, so we can usually pick up on it pretty quickly. There's a lot of signs that will make us go, aha. Then the other side of it is a lot of Jane and John Does and suspects have an unknown father or a misattributed father. I've seen it in so many cases, and so many of our unidentified human remains cases are adopted. That's harder.
That's really interesting.
Because they're not connecting. I have a case, 2 cases. I have one in Australia and one here in the US, where we know both biological parents and all full siblings. It's a married couple with kids, but they're dead, the parents, and they had another child they placed for adoption, maybe before they were married. And none of the siblings know about this person, but we absolutely have it proven that they are full siblings with the exact same parents, and we don't know who these people are. So we have their biological identity in both these John Doe cases, but not their legal identity that they lived under. So we haven't solved the case. It's so frustrating.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, on suspect cases, a lot of times I identify the father of the suspect, but he doesn't have a son that fits our profile, or, or we test his son and he's not the right one, or he doesn't have a son, or that doesn't have any connection to the area of the crime. And then I've got to go back and try to find mom's side, try to come down mom's side and hope she didn't place him for adoption and that she raised him and he just thought his father was someone else. And so that's usually, just so happens, they're always much more distant matches. So I have a lot of cases where my best matches all go to dad's side, and dad doesn't have a known son that fits. And then I got to go to the much more distant matches and start all over with mom. And so it is a real challenge in our cases. And it makes some cases, rather than taking a few hours, or a couple days, take a year. And then if the suspect is adopted, or the Jane or John Doe, some states, law enforcement can go and search adoption records. So we've been able to solve cases that way, but some judges don't like that at all. So
Yeah. No, when you said that, it reminded me, I think there's a lot of family secrets that go on. And Chris has, when you said that there was the parents were married and that there were a bunch of kids, biological kids, and then they gave away one of the siblings. That was a mystery that Chris was trying to figure out in his family this was many, many decades and decades ago, but he was doing his family genealogy, and that was kind of the exact scenario. And it just reminded me of
Irish.
That.
They were living in New York. Long story short, my mother's 9 kids, and one of the kids, I was going through the census, and the next year she wasn't there. And I was like, what? What do you mean? And so I started digging, and I found a family member in Vermont. Was it? Is that where
somewhere on the East Coast,
anyway,
maybe Connecticut.
And anyway, we connected. We started talking. Long story short, she shows me a picture of her mom. And I thought I was looking at my mother, right, in this photograph. And I called her up and I said, where did you get this photograph? She goes, well, that's my mom. I said, oh my gosh. Anyway, we did the genealogy thing, and we were first cousins. And come to find out, it was her mother who was given away to an Italian family during the Depression. And my mother was the oldest girl. There were 6 girls, and her name was Sandy. And I ended up connecting the families. And years later, my mother's sister, who's the only survivor now, who's still with us, they got to meet their long lost sister, and it was crazy how it all unfolded. I mean, not to take it away from the conversation here, but
it's part of it. It is.
Yeah,
I think there's more of that in people's family histories than maybe what they know.
So much more than we ever imagined before consumer DNA testing. It's been fascinating being on the front lines of this from the beginning and learning about human nature and all of the family secrets. It's way more than I ever could have imagined. It's literally millions of people that have taken these tests and found out something extremely significant, or I should say have been found an unexpected surprise that was extremely significant. Either they weren't the child of one or both of their biological parents, or they had a really close family member they never knew about that they find through the database. So it does have a big impact on what we're doing. And I just want to say, all the people in the chat, some of you are saying you're adopted and you still have that unresolved. You can write to admin, ADMIN, at the DNA detectives with an S.com, and we can get you a volunteer from my DNA detectives group to work with you to help you resolve that. That's admin at the DNA detectives.
Say ADM.
admin at the DNA detectives with an S.com. And we have a volunteer team behind the scenes. You can also just join the DNA detective group on DNA detectives group on Facebook. It's about 240,000 people, and you can find a search angel there or a DNA detective. But if you aren't on Facebook or you want to be more private, you can email that address and we'll find you somebody.
And we've got links to all that in the description box on this video. So you guys can.
And I just put it into chat too.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I tried to join chat and I couldn't. So thank you for adding that.
And there's no gap between that, so I just messed it up. Sorry.
But it's close.
But doesn't that, that's what happens, right?
What about sealed adoptions? It doesn't matter. It's from your DNA. All the laws don't matter. We've gotten around all the laws because it's your DNA and you deserve the right to know your family history. So
how does somebody get
right?
So it has to be you if you want sealed adoption records. If it's somebody else, can you get sealed adoption records?
If you're their child in some states you can, but it doesn't matter. I'm saying you can figure out through your DNA. So you don't need to get your adoption records unsealed. Many of the states have started unsealing them because we were solving the mystery anyway. We were telling people who their birth parents were left and right. And so a number of the states said, you know what, we might as well just open them because it's more private that way than connecting to birth mom's second cousin, right? You know, when we do the work as professionals, we're really careful about reaching out. We don't want to like out birth mom or a donor dad, for instance. But a lot of people just do it themselves and they don't necessarily know. They just reach out to all of their top matches. And then, you know, some birth parents have been outed that way. So a lot of the states, I think, have reasoned, well, wait a minute, if we just give them their records, they can go directly to mom or directly to dad that way.
Gotcha. How about that question about heat and DNA?
Yeah, this is
Put that one back up.
another great question. Does heat deteriorate DNA?
It does. I mean, I'm not a forensic scientist. I can't tell you to what degree it does, but certainly, you know, there are remains that have been burned. The DNA Doe Project, for instance, worked on the victims from the Paradise fire, that terrible fire where a lot of people were just stuck, a lot of elderly people, and they were able to get DNA from the majority of those remains, and they helped with identification. But sometimes, you know, they're just too burned. There's just not enough there. But even from when someone is cremated, sometimes there are bone fragments that can still be analyzed and DNA extracted. So yes, it definitely degrades it, but it doesn't necessarily destroy it. It depends on the heat and the length of time. There's a lot of factors that go into it.
Let's see here. Let's keep moving. Thanks, Chris, Karen, CeCe. 41-minute gap. Was Nancy in PJs? We don't know that. Groggy seniors need help to address assisted changes, leave DNA. Did family police ID missing clothes? We don't have that answer yet. Who drove her in her neck? Yeah, great question. We don't have those answers yet.
Someone asked if I have my DNA uploaded. Of course. I'm one of the first people. I was one of the very first people ever to upload to GEDmatch to test for genealogy at all of these companies. I am an early adopter, one of the pioneers, you know, group of us who wanted to see if we could use this type of DNA to extend our family trees. And under the radar, we built this incredibly powerful tool for human identification before anyone took us seriously. You know, people used to laugh at us and roll their eyes, and there wasn't much interest in our little genealogy research project until now. And now that Pandora's out of the box, you know, it's too late to put her back in. So of course I'm everywhere. My DNA is everywhere. My parents' DNA, my aunts and uncles. I've tested 40 of my family members way back in 2010 when this was first just getting going. And they're all in GEDmatch. Most of them are in DNA Justice. So yes, and yes. I wouldn't advocate for other people to do it and not do it myself.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Being in former LE, they had everything else. I might as well give them my DNA. So
let me get to this question. Is it possible that this is a terminology issue? In other words, they may have the SNP, the SMP profile, but the problem would be with the IgG, perhaps due to a Latin American, Native American, or another underrepresented population in the sample.
I don't think so, because at first he said something that led me to believe it was a mixture issue. And then later he actually said the words mixture. That's pretty clear. At first he used non-traditional language that you could interpret, but then he came out and said mixture. I don't think that's the problem. If it was just, if they had a SNP profile that was viable, you know, this person would be identified very, very quickly, because if they need more resources, they can bring them in. The FBI has trained 200 people to do investigative genetic genealogy. They can put as many resources on this case as they want. So if I'm working the case alone and it's a recent immigrant, it could take me a year or more. I've been working on St. Louis Jane Doe or Precious Jane Doe for like 7 years. It's really difficult. And I have my whole team working on it now. She's African-American, an African-American little girl. When you asked me about my favorite case, right, well, that's my priority unsolved case. You know, I've been working on it for a very long time, but with the FBI resources, they should be able to identify this person relatively quickly. Because as I said, they can put as many people on it as they want. I like to work my cases alone typically because we're looking for patterns, right? If I'm working one branch and my colleague is working another, I may miss, we may miss the connections. But on a case where it's a real race against time like this one, I just would be very surprised if they didn't have a big team working on it, in conjunction with each other, maybe sitting in a big room. And that, I think they would identify the person, even if they have immigrant ancestry, within weeks. Something that might take me a lot longer if I was all by myself working on it, right? And if I was working a case like this and I needed extra hands, I would bring in all my colleagues too, because again, it's a race against time. It's not about like ego. It's about saving someone's life.
Right.
And so I think that, people would be working together. DNA Labs International, maybe their genetic genealogy team and the FBI genetic genealogy team. Nobody's going to hold off, just because they want to be the one to solve it.
Good point. What's this one?
CeCe, after solving a crime, are you providing the victim's family the tree that you put together while solving the crime?
Sometimes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sometimes
the detective has asked me to provide it. I don't provide like details. I'll just give a screenshot so they can then take that and build their own tree based on, what I've done. It's a really good question. Yeah. Sometimes people ask for it.
Coinciding with solving a case, you're building a family history and perhaps unknowingly uniting families, bringing loved ones together. Have you found that?
Yeah. And we've solved mysteries a lot in our work that has to stay in a private tree, right? I found out somebody's birth parents and I don't know, should we tell them or should we not? Because they didn't ask us to do that. So there's also always that ethical dilemma. But if the detective is in touch with somebody on the case and they ask to see what I have found, every detective I've worked so far with has asked me to do that, asked me to share that information. So like I said, I don't share every detail, but I certainly do give them some information on their own family tree. It's their family.
Okay. Elizabeth asked, is law enforcement keeping Annie Guthrie and her husband's car based on testing of Nancy Guthrie's hair? What if Nancy was drugged out of the house? The 2-minute garage door opening was Nancy being carried in. Maybe violence came when Nancy woke up. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
We don't know. We don't have those answers.
And I'll say that when I am working a case, the only reason I can talk about this case is because I'm not working it. When I am working a case, it can be very frustrating to hear all of the criticism of law enforcement and the speculation that goes on when I know like law enforcement is doing everything they can possibly do. And then you hear all this criticism from the public who doesn't know. So I just ask for a little bit of grace. There's been so much negativity and criticism, and we don't know if there've been mistakes, but give them the benefit of the doubt, because very often they are holding things close to the vest in an investigation. And it's so hard when you have to bite your tongue, right? And you can't. And I've had like victims, family members, and survivors of violent crime writing to me too, asking me about cases that I was in the middle of working and not able to say anything. And so, I just think we all need to like step back a little bit and be careful about jumping to conclusions.
And I also think time, if you stand back and look, the media really forces this time frame. Day 1, day 2, day 29, day 30, day 20. Oh, it's the 1 month anniversary. Well, Chris has been saying for 5 years on this channel, and of course, CeCe, it's not on the media's time frame to solve cases, right? Everybody's so used to TV shows like CSI wrapping it up in 52 minutes. And these cases take time. From what you're describing, some of these mysteries take years to unravel. Again, I'm not saying this Nancy Guthrie case is going to take years, but
I don't think
1 month, it's such an artificial time frame that we can't assume it's all done, wrapped up, an arrest is made, justice is moving forward. It's just not realistic.
And yes, I think the case will be solved.
I do too. This is a good question.
Could there be enough DNA for IgG, but not enough for CODIS? I think we talked about
It's not so much about amount. It's a different type of analysis. So yes, sometimes we can create a SNP profile when they cannot create a STR profile. Possible, especially with hair, by the way. With rootless hair, they cannot create an STR profile from that, but we absolutely can get a SNP profile, or Astrea can, Dr. Ed Green's company, and perform genetic genealogy. And that's happened in a number of cases now.
Wisdom says, also, it doesn't look like they took the doorknob, which was probably the first thing his saliva-coated hands would have touched. Chris, I don't think they need to take the doorknob in order to swab the doorknob. You can leave the doorknob and identify a swab, package it up, send it in for DNA analysis, and leave it, correct?
Yeah, and we don't know with the tent up that the FBI put. We know they were taking measurements and that kind of stuff, but we don't know if they collected some of that debris that the suspect had picked up. We definitely know the mat, though. The mat is still there. So, but you would expect them to have swabbed that door frame and the doorknob in its totality, as well as around the camera where he's seen.
Swab the mat even, but maybe they should still do MVAC on it if they haven't.
Yeah, they should take it. I agree with you. Our team would have taken it. I would have said, get that out of here. But to your point earlier, it may be too late. Let's see here. Can they tell old DNA from new?
Depends on the degradation. Certainly older DNA tends to have more degradation. They measure what's called a degradation index. So usually, but not always, because as I said, we have analyzed blood samples from crime scenes that ended up being left there by a prior occupant years earlier. So you can't always tell. Sometimes it's a pretty pristine sample, even when it's old. There are so many variables that go into it.
DNA Angels found my birth parents in 3 days.
This is awesome.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's common now because you can compare against 50 million people. Now, working investigative genetic genealogy is like stepping back to 2014, trying to solve an adoption case. When you have 50 million people, most people are going to be able to find their biological families very quickly, with a few exceptions.
This one, Metal Cubana says, I got FBI door knock to ask me to opt in my GEDmatch kits. How rare is that? I'm the family genealogist, love figuring out my DNA matches.
It's not all that rare, actually. The FBI does a lot of door knocks. So that's one of the things that can mean that they solve a case more quickly. So we do something in some cases called target testing or reference testing. If we don't have enough matches in GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA or DNA Justice, then we have to create additional data points. And so we might ask somebody if they're willing to contribute their DNA. If they've already taken a test, but they don't have it in the databases we can access, we ask them to download their raw data and upload it and opt in at GEDmatch, for instance. But if they haven't taken a test, sometimes law enforcement will bring a swab over and ask if they're willing to contribute their DNA to solving this case. And so the FBI has agents everywhere, right? I mean, all over the country. And they can go like that to ask somebody if they're willing to provide their DNA. Whereas if I'm working with an agency in, say, Florida, and we need someone's DNA from Oregon, there's a lot of coordination that has to go on between the agencies, the local agencies. But if the FBI is involved, they can just get somebody out there, boom, that day or the next day. And so that's one of the reasons that I think this case will be solved more quickly than a lot of other cases that don't have as much attention and resources to them.
Yeah.
Casey says, how do we know this unknown DNA inside Nancy Guthrie house is the suspect?
We don't.
I get the DNA is not a family member, but who is today this suspect? It's a huge house. I'm sure many people, it hosted many people throughout the years.
Yeah, I don't know, Casey, if you heard me earlier saying exactly that. We don't know. Their job is to deconvolute these profiles so they can be identified and then determined whether they could potentially be the suspect. There's no way of knowing that. until they're identified. Now, as I said, if it had been a mixture of fresh blood between hers and an unknown male, then that was pretty likely going to be her kidnapper, right? Or one of, at least. But with other types of DNA samples and mixtures, there's still a good chance it isn't. And they can't even eliminate somebody from those mixtures if they're too complex, right? So those mixtures could have some of the family's DNA in it, even if they're really a high number of contributors, right? Because you have to be able to first extract out that profile before you can eliminate it as a known associate or family member. So we don't. And as I've repeatedly said, you know, you can leave your DNA anywhere. You can have your DNA transferred somewhere you've never even been. So as technology sensitivity has increased, the caution used also has to increase. And you can't jump to conclusions that just because someone's DNA is found at a crime scene, that they are responsible for that crime.
That makes sense. There has to be other evidence pointing to this person being in the house and other circumstances that could put them as a viable suspect. That's
and not associated previously. Like maybe someone gets identified and they prove that they worked on Nancy's air conditioning 3 years ago, right? You don't know till you know. That's why you got to get these people identified so you can rule them in or rule them out. It's really the beginning of the investigation in a lot of ways. And that's why we emphasize so often that investigative genetic genealogy is a lead generator. It is simply a tip. It's a highly scientific tip, but we are not saying that someone is a suspect. That's up to law enforcement to determine.
And that makes sense. So Breezy says Nancy's perp had a flashlight in his mouth. And we did talk about this a little earlier in today's video. Anything in your mouth would create saliva DNA. But the perp could have taken the light out of his mouth and saliva would be all over the gloves. CeCe, that was your exact point. How are all the touch points found with saliva?
A swab, but you have to have a very thorough crime scene investigator. And I've been amazed on cases I've worked. The crime scene investigator just thought to swab something and it ended up being the key to the case. You can't see DNA, right? Unless it's like blood or something, but you can't see microscopic DNA. So they just have to be very, very thorough and use their experience to predict where there might be DNA, right? Like door handles, like faucets, like the toilet, like we talked about, the bedside table, perhaps if she was asleep, you don't know. Lights, maybe they turned a light on. You just have to be, I think, really creative and very thorough if you are doing that job. And there are some fantastic crime scene investigators out there, like I said, that I've been amazed that have swabbed something. They're like, I think I'm going to swab the victim right here, even though there was nothing they could see. And it turned out there was saliva there. And that's how we identified the killer. It's incredible. So we just have to hope. We've got to stay positive here and hope and pray that they have the DNA, or if they don't, that they soon will.
Yeah. Nathaniel says, when you put your DNA in a genetic test companies, would there be a possibility of HIPAA law being an obstacle? Just curious.
No, it's not health related, and it's voluntarily provided. I mean, you could argue 23andMe is primarily for health testing, but that's not the only thing it's used for. And it's not done by a healthcare provider. So I think I'm not an expert on HIPAA, but I think it just governs healthcare providers, which these companies are not.
I love Mikey. He always comes up
Take that one,
with
Chris.
these curveballs. Love it, man.
Can you read it?
Sure. Should solve the mystery of Oliver the Human Z's scientific mystery from the 80s. Was that a hybrid or ever solved? I don't know that one, bro, but I'm going to look it up.
Sounds interesting.
I love it.
Yeah, and yes, should be. I mean, if the DNA exists.
I love the get up too in his picture.
Yes, Rachel Morin's case was solved through IGG. It was the FBI IGG team, and they don't do media. So a lot of times when they're the ones that solve the case, you don't really hear that much about it because they're not out there doing interviews about it. And I'll always try to give them credit when I know. So they deserve credit on that case. That had to have been difficult. Another one of those immigrant ancestry cases. And again, it doesn't have to be that person is an immigrant. Let me emphasize this. So I'm not just talking about immigrants this generation. I'm talking, 3-4 generations back. It can have an impact.
They caught him in a bar in Tulsa.
Yeah, but I'm
All right.
sure there was a lot of work before they got there.
This is a loaded question. So do you think there'll be a break in the John Bonet case soon?
No, I don't. I mean, everyone asks me, why am I not solving it? Well, first of all, I can't work on it unless Boulder asks me to, which they're not. I get emails almost every day or comments on my social media. Some people get mad at me. Why haven't you solved your case? I can't unless I have access to DNA. And I don't believe they even have a DNA sample that's viable for genetic genealogy, or it would already be solved by now. So unless something changes, maybe with the equipment getting more sensitive, you know, an unknown perpetrator's DNA will be found at some point, but I just don't have a lot of confidence at this point because it's been so long. We've been doing investigative genetic genealogy for almost 8 years. And I know that Boulder police gets constant emails and phone calls, you know, telling them to do it. So if they could solve it, I can't imagine they wouldn't have already.
United States Dale says, what type of evidence can be found inside a car? And how, I think DNA evidence, and how long would it take to process it?
Well, it can be processed very, very quickly. Any type of DNA evidence could be left behind in a car. There could be any sort of biological evidence. The most likely would be transfer DNA or touch DNA. A lot of forensic scientists are moving away from that term, touch. They're calling it transfer DNA. But certainly skin cells, sweat, hair. My hair is always in the car. So I'm sure some, you know, maybe if you're bleeding a little, I pick my finger at my cuticles, you know, so like I might leave blood behind in my car. There's all kinds of things you could. Maybe food or cups, water bottles, anything like that can be in a car. There's a lot of great sources of DNA in people's cars. But again, it could be very old DNA, the person who owned the car before the current owner.
It could be a gold mine where you push even for your seatbelt.
Yes. Great point. Yeah. You're unlikely to be wearing gloves doing that unless you live somewhere really freezing.
Yep. And by the way, we only have 2 more questions left.
Okay. T. Marie says,
Awesome.
There was a leaf stuck in the doorbell mount left behind, seen in the media's photo. Couldn't plant matter be tested?
Sure, to find out if it's from the local area or somewhere else. I mean, I think it's unlikely it was transferred from somewhere else, but they certainly could test that. I mean, that's been in a lot of cases where they test soil. And that was something with the shoes. I always thought, you know, there's not just DNA that would have been tracked. There might have been soil tracked from a different location. For instance, if the person did come over the border, then they might have been able to find soil on that mat or around the crime scene that traced back to a different location and not the local area.
That's a great point. That is a really great point. And that really would have helped in the investigation, I would think. So
yeah, and they may be doing that. I'd be surprised if they weren't, because we've seen it in a lot of cases over the decades.
Yeah, and in this particular question, are detective investigators' gloves and booties that were worn in Nancy's house safe to be tested for DNA they might have picked up?
That's a great question.
Yeah, typically you want to throw it into a bag and throw it into evidence. You can put a number on it, throw it into evidence, because anything that you bring in obviously will come out, i.e. if you cross-contaminate it onto something else. And that's why it's always important when investigators get on the scene almost immediately, you want to identify a fire guys or who came into that scene, and you want photographs, you want all kinds of, you know, pictures of their boots and their things. Firefighters used to, all the fire guys, you know, didn't like standing there while you're taking pictures of their boots at 2 o'clock in the morning because they want to go home back into bed. I'm teasing, but there
was a couple of questions. Can I jump in?
Of course.
Yes, of course.
Okay, there was one that said, can you create a face from DNA? Yes, and that's what Parabon originally did, and that's how they became experts on SNP testing of forensic DNA. They were using SNP testing to predict people's eye color, skin color, hair color, shape, face. They still do that, though less so. We use it in conjunction with genetic genealogy a lot, and it helps us often to not point the finger at an innocent person. So if there's 4 brothers and 2 have blue eyes and 2 have brown, and we have a 99.5% 5% confidence level that he has brown eyes, then law enforcement can focus on the 2 brown-eyed brothers. And so that's something that's missed a lot about investigative genetic genealogy and phenotyping, which is what you're mentioning there, is it can eliminate the vast majority of the population from ever being suspected of a crime. So that's one of the greatest things about it. We can't always tell them exactly who the suspect is, but we can tell them who it is not, because it's only going to fit a very limited number of people's trees and physical traits. So that's a great question that someone asked. So I just wanted to mention that. And now,
what other traits can you pull? I mean, eye color, you can get, obviously a geographic region of where they came from, what do they call that? CM? Is that what they're called?
Centimorgans. Yeah, that's the unit of measurement of how much DNA is shared between 2 people. So you and your parents share about 3,600 centimorgans. You and your second cousin share maybe 260 centimorgans. So it just gets smaller and smaller and smaller as your common ancestor is further back in your family tree in general. And so if you share a lot of centimorgans with someone, then they're a very close relative. If you share just 50 centimorgans, they might be your third cousin. They might be further out.
When you say a close relative, you mean from in what lane? Like first, second cousins, that kind of thing?
Well,
what do you consider a close relative?
To me, second cousins, because I can almost always identify someone from their second cousin, but most people consider that a distant relative. So it's really just a perspective. In the CODIS database, when they do familial searching, when I say a close relative, they're looking for first degree. They're looking for an immediate relative, a parent, child, or a full sibling. For us, it's rare that we get a first degree or even a second degree. Second degree would be like a half sibling, aunt, uncle, grandparent, grandchild. Third degree is first cousin. We're still thrilled if we get a first cousin or a half aunt, uncle, niece, nephew, great uncle, great aunt, that kind of thing. Most often we're working with fourth degree, second cousins and beyond. But
if there are CMs, are they definitely connected to that family line somewhere?
Yeah. So if you share over, say, 30 centimorgans with someone, you are definitely related. You just have to figure out how, and that's going to be probably really far back. The companies usually give your matches. They used to do down to 7 centimorgans, but as the databases have grown, I think some of them, their threshold is like 10 centimorgans now. When you get that low, it is possible to have coincidental shared DNA. So you have to be a lot more careful with those matches. But once you get to like 30, 40 centimorgans, it's really unlikely you have that by coincidence. But this is really a deep dive. If you come from a population group that has what's called endogamy or pedigree collapse, everyone in that population group can share like 40 centimorgans or 50 centimorgans, depending on the population group. Like pretty much all Puerto Ricans share DNA with other Puerto Ricans because they come from this island. So they had a closed gene pool for the most part. Ashkenazi Jews intermarried for millennia. So most Ashkenazi Jews will share a little bit of DNA with each other. So you also have to know your population groups, right? Because if you're working in a population group that has endogamy or pedigree collapse, which are 2 different things but related, then you have to know that the amount of DNA is going to be inflated, and they're probably related further back than you would normally predict from that.
Fascinating.
How about Hawaii? Look at Hawaii. How about Hawaii?
Would that be a closed group?
Oh, so hard. So I tried to work a case for the Innocence Project in Hawaii, but it was a Hawaiian native. And it was extremely difficult because they have such high level of endogamy. So anytime you've got geographic limitations, right? Like there's a really high mountain on one side and an ocean on the other, or an island like that, it's going to be a more closed population group. So you're going to have that endogamous nature to that population group. But it's all different. Like Puerto Ricans, how much they share with each other on average is different than what Hawaiians share on average, and what Ashkenazi Jews share on average, and what people who have deep pedigree collapse in, say, North Carolina share with each other. There's different levels of it. And that's why it's important to have experience with as many different population groups as you possibly can before you start doing this professionally. So if this is something you want to do, which a lot of people do, you want to work with DNA results from as many people as you can from as many different population groups. So that was one of the great things about me working and finding your roots for 13 years is it gave me the opportunity to work with DNA from so many different population groups because we purposely pick guests from different population groups. So that has been an amazing way to learn and then be able to take that information forward. Also, I've worked on thousands of adoption cases and unknown parentage cases of all different, ancestral backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds. So it's been an amazing training ground. Then when I look at the matches and the ancestry on these law enforcement cases, I right away know how to assess those. And a lot of law enforcement will look and they go, oh my gosh, we have all these matches that are like second cousins. And I have to come in and burst their bubble and say, no, you're looking at Puerto Ricans and they all, look like that, for instance, or Hawaiians or whatever that population group is. There's so many. We're finding new population groups all the time that have a level of endogamy. And, it can be just a town where certain families founded it and many of their descendants stayed in that town and intermarried. And they're not close cousins, but they're like third cousins 3 times over and fourth cousins 8 times over. So it's not just, a couple of population groups. There's many, many, many ones. But yeah, the one in Hawaii, a former FBI lawyer, Steve Kramer, finally did solve that case, but the guy killed himself. So it didn't go to trial. And the guy who had been convicted wrongly hasn't been formally exonerated because there was never a trial. So it's actually really sad because there's somebody who's been convicted of that crime that they now know is not responsible, but just, with formalities, it's very difficult then for them to move forward apparently, and to grant that, that formal exoneration of actual innocence that we just saw in the yogurt shop murders, by the way. The 4 men there were just formally exonerated 10 days ago.
Good for you.
And given actual innocence, which is just an amazing thing. It's, such a wonderful thing when that happens.
Wow. So here's a question here, referring to DNA transfer to the plant. Can you pull DNA off of those plants, you think? I think that's the...
She was clarifying.
DNA on the outside of his gloves. Yes. Yeah. But at that point, maybe he didn't yet. He might have just put those gloves on when he got out of the car. I was more interested in later, if he was there 40 minutes or approximately 40 minutes, and somebody said you turn the bite flashlight on and off with your mouth. Yes, but did he keep it in his mouth for 40 minutes? It seems unlikely. Yeah. That's where I feel like the later things he touched would be more likely to have that transfer DNA than the earlier things. But again, it's all speculation.
Right.
I don't know.
Do you think Pima and FBI both collected DNA?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I would think it'd be Pima County, but I don't know.
This one, human microchip implant. Can I use it for my 90-year-old mom? You know what? Just get her one of those neck bracelets.
Neck bracelets?
You know what they are? Necklaces, though, that you can track the elderly. I think that's a good thing rather than put a microchip in her.
I really agree with these people that keep saying about the bathroom. I do, because like Chris, we've solved cases with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hopefully they were very thorough swabbing everything in that bathroom, faucets, toilet seat, the flusher, all of that.
In this one, they had to do everything. That's for sure. I believe it's going to be solved.
I do.
And I think it's just going to be a matter of patience, and all the answers are going to come.
Someone asked about DNA justice. You can just enter your grandparents.
Yes.
That when you upload, they'll ask for your grandparents. We don't have a way yet to upload your family tree, but that's enough for us to build the tree. Sorry about that. Didn't want to interrupt.
No, you're fine. Yeah, no,
I
this
can't
is
see
great.
the questions over there.
GEDmatch, you can upload your GEDCOM. So you can download your GEDCOM from wherever you built your family tree and upload that directly to GEDmatch. It's at the bottom when you're uploading your DNA. At the bottom, there's a link that says upload your GEDCOM.
Awesome. What else do you want to? We always give our guests the last word. Is there anything else you want to talk about or go through here on this particular case? Tell people where they can find you again, so that those of you And by the way, we started an hour earlier tonight. We had some scheduling situations, so but we'll be back.
I thought I had an interview at 6, but it got canceled because of
I had
Iran.
to take her away
So
from
we were
national
able to go extra long.
Well, we are so grateful you have been with us tonight, CeCe. In my opinion, you are a national treasure.
Yes, she is.
And the work you do is literally God's work, because you started off at the beginning saying, not only do you help find suspects, especially for these violent crimes, but you exonerate the innocent as well. And that's
in a much bigger way than people realize, because you only see the ones that are formally exonerated. But I've had many people that were suspected of a crime by their communities, by the victims' families for years, reach out to me and say, thank you so much for finally fully lifting that burden off my shoulders, because it ruins people's lives even when they're not convicted. And we see that in the yogurt shop murders. 2 of the men were convicted, 2 weren't, but they made statements. Well, the living ones made statements at the hearing a week and a half ago and said it destroyed their lives, even if they weren't convicted. And so just lifting that burden, or better yet, keeping innocent people out of the investigation from the beginning, is what we hope moving forward. The true power of investigative genetic genealogy is, 1, to eliminate the vast majority of ever being suspected of a violent crime, of innocent people, keeping them out of the investigation, and 2, to stop violent criminals in their tracks, to keep people from being serial offenders and from hurting additional people. We can stop them after the first violent crime now. And that's where we can have the biggest impact. That's not to say that I don't think the cold cases are important, because I absolutely do. We should continue working on the cold cases. But I'm thrilled to see law enforcement and the media and the public now saying, wait a minute, shouldn't they be using investigative genetic genealogy on a case like Nancy's, on a case like Brian Kohberger's? And even if I don't get to work these cases, I am so thrilled that the public and law enforcement is waking up to that idea of getting investigative genetic genealogy involved much, much earlier in the process, before innocent people are pulled into an investigation and before more people are victimized. And so we can save lives. And I'm sure we've already saved lives. We'll never know it, fortunately, because those people will never be victimized, right? But there's no doubt in my mind, by getting hundreds of criminals, violent criminals, off the streets over the 7.5 years we've been doing this, almost 8, we undoubtedly have solved lives. And as I said earlier, I'm sure Kohberger was going to victimize more people. You know, you can argue with me if you want, but we know he was.
You're right.
We agree.
Yeah. Right. He was downloading information on serial killers. So that's clearly what his goal was. And I think that's true of anybody who we've proven is capable of this type of violent crime. They're always capable of doing it again. And many of the people we've helped identify have been victimizing their own family members. And so that brings up an important point. People will say to me, well, I don't want one of my loved ones getting convicted of a crime because I provided my DNA. But you need to look at it the other way too. Do you want someone who's capable of this type of violence around your loved ones? Do you want your children around them? Do you want your grandmother around them? Do you want them sitting at your Thanksgiving table, when they have this capability in them? And so I think people need to look at it a little differently. Yes, it's horrible if a close family member ends up getting tied to a violent crime like this and eventually convicted of a violent crime. But the other option is not good either, that you keep them in your inner circle and that they could victimize somebody in your family that you love, or you.
You speak with authenticity, and what an amazing, as Maureen O'Connell would say, the former FBI gal, she goes, you have a 10-pound brain.
It's a compliment.
And that is a compliment.
That's why I get migraines?
No, whenever she says that, everybody goes, what? But she means you're highly intelligent and you know exactly what you're talking about. And we're just so blessed to have your time tonight. And can I ask you this? Will you come back?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's so many cases to talk about.
Yeah.
And, I want to say, please, please, please donate your DNA. If you support what we do, don't just passively support us. We know we have about 91% of support from the public, but there's nowhere near that type of active support. We need to grow our databases that law enforcement can access. So please, if you support us, if you've taken a DNA test, upload to DNA Justice, upload to GEDmatch, opt into law enforcement matching, and please help me get St. Louis Jane Doe solved. If you're African American, please, please, please contribute your DNA. And I understand why people are hesitant, but you know, it's a double-edged sword there, because if people don't contribute their DNA, we also can't help bring home their family members, their unidentified family members. So it kind of disadvantages them, or it doesn't kind of, it does disadvantage them in that side of the research as well. And you can upload to GEDmatch for Jane and John Doe cases and not for violent criminals. So everyone in the database can be compared against Jane and John Doe cases, but you have to check the box to be compared against violent crimes. But of course, a warrant could override that. So just know if your DNA is in any database, there's potential it could be compared against one of these cases. But right now, as of this moment, it's only being compared against what you consent to, what you're opted into.
Awesome. Anything, Karen?
Well, thanks again, CeCe. We're so grateful for your time, and we can't wait to have you back to talk about other cases.
Yeah, let's talk about other cases. This one, of course, deserves all the attention, but there are many, many, many others that also deserve attention that don't get it.
Many out there. So we have a tradition on our show. We go to Hawaii at the end. I lived in Hawaii as a kid. My dad was in the Marine Corps, so he was stationed in Kaneohe at the Marine Corps Air Station over there. And ultimately, he got transferred over to Camp Pendleton. That's how we ended up in Southern California. But so we have a little thing that we do. We want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. And of course, CeCe, she's, as you can tell and know and have learned, she's fascinating. Is not only that, she's doing God's work in many different ways. So tonight we want to keep into our prayers all those people around the world who may be suffering right now in relationship to some of the world activities that are taking place. Please keep our men and women of the armed forces in your prayers, as well as our first responders. They just had a situation in Austin last night, and we're praying for them out there, our nurses, our doctors, our cops, our firefighters, all the people on the front lines. Please keep them in your prayers. And of course, CeCe, she's on the front lines as well, trying to catch these serial offenders out there. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. What a great program it was, but it was even greater with you being here. Aloha and akamai. Thank you.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away.